Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online event, 30 Minutes with Sylvia Arthur, as part of the exhibition Afrika, Poetries of a Continent, which is currently at display at Strauhof, Zurich, and which is curated by Strauhof and the Litar Foundation. My name is Nicole Schmid, and I am the assistant curator of the exhibition. The exhibition stages, in a nutshell, the works of various African poets as a result of having got access to archival material from the Swiss literary mediator and journalist Al Imfeld, who dedicated his life to promoting African poets in the German-speaking world. The exhibition can thus also be regarded as a platform to discuss today's relevance and role and responsibilities of such archives. We are therefore very excited to virtually meet and listen to Sylvia Arthur, who is the founder of the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora LOATAD, a library, archive, writing residency and research institute in Accra, Ghana, dedicated to the work of African and diaspora writers from the late 19th century to the present day. Sylvia started LOATAD formerly called Library Ghana, using 1,300 of her own books in 2017, and she has since then curated 6 libraries, including school, community, and corporate libraries. She's an advocate for the restitution of African literary archives to the continent and has delivered numerous talks and presentations on the subject. A journalist by training, she's a 2022 National Geographic Explorer, working to document the stories of West African women aged 60 plus and restore them to history through the creation of an expansive oral archive. Sylvia is a 2-time TED speaker, an Africa No Filter narrative champion, and a Creative Activism Award recipient. Sylvia is now joining us from Accra, Ghana, and will give a presentation on the archive called Collecting the Past, Documenting the Present, Archiving the Future. Thank you, Sylvia, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you, Nicole, for that introduction, and thank you to Christa Baumberger at Litar and Rémi Jaccard and Philippe Sippel at Strauhof for inviting me to give this talk. So I will begin. The talk will last about 18 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Over the past 2 years, the movement to return stolen artifacts of great cultural significance to their countries of origin has gathered momentum, particularly in relation to Greece and the Elgin marbles, and Nigeria and the Benin bronzes. These bronze sculptures, which are currently in museums in Europe, were created from at least the 16th century to decorate the royal court in the Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria. But in 1897, British forces launched a bloody and devastating military occupation of Benin. Thousands of the artworks were stolen and taken to the United Kingdom as the spoils of war. As a result of sustained pressure from activists and artists, both in Africa and Europe, hundreds of the artifacts have been or are set to be returned to Nigeria. The Horniman Museum in the UK recently announced that it's to return 72 Benin bronzes in its custody. In February of this year, the University of Aberdeen and Cambridge University's Jesus College returned 2 Benin bronzes. In 2021, the French government returned 26 artworks seized from Benin in 1892. And in November of 2021, the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of African Art in Washington, DC, removed all of its Benin bronzes from display and announced plans to repatriate them. So what have the Benin bronzes got to do with contemporary African literature? It's helpful to frame discussions around African literary archives within the context of current debates about the restitution of African artifacts. Of course, there is a major caveat that needs to be made in placing archives within this controversial framework, which is this. While the archives of prominent African writers such as Chinua Achebe, Amos Tutuola, and Okot Pipitek were not stolen from the continent, they were sold to or otherwise legally acquired by the institutions that currently hold them. We need to consider a key reason why these archives live so far from their places of creation. And it's the same reason why the Benin bronzes were looted: the pursuit of empire and the subsequent underdevelopment of Africa. Colonialism, capitalism, specifically racial capitalism, as defined by Cedric J. Robinson in his seminal work, Black Marxism, and yes, bad governance or corruption, the 3 C's as I like to call them, colonialism, capitalism, and corruption, have all conspired to rob African institutions of sufficient resources, be it financial, technological, or the expertise to maintain such collections. This leaves Africa's great writers with little choice but to exercise their right to sell or donate their archives to institutions they believe are best suited to take care of them, and by extension, whose users have the requisite knowledge and skills to get the most out of them. These institutions are almost always in the West. This circumstance is a result of underdevelopment. The Guyanese academic Walter Rodney showed how African underdevelopment was a deliberate strategy employed by European powers. Yet ironically, it is this underdevelopment which is now used as an argument against the repatriation of African artifacts by those same powers who would prefer them to stay in Europe. Just as the Benin bronzes were stolen, so too was Africa's ability to fully realize itself, and with it, its capacity to develop robust institutions to preserve our cultural and literary heritage. This, however, is not a reason enough why the artifacts and archives should not be returned, but that's an argument for another day. Which leads me to the issue of prestige. All writers want their work to be considered alongside the literary greats of the world. All writers want to be part of the canon. Whether it's being recognized for a Booker, a Pulitzer, or a Nobel, the ultimate recognition of mastery of one's craft as a writer is conferred by the awarding of these prizes, which are set in and judged by the West. The standard by which the world assesses a writer against is not the best in his or her country or continent, but against his or her peers in the world, usually the Western world. Consequently, what writer wouldn't want their archives to be housed at Yale or Princeton, the British Library or the University of Texas, alongside such distinguished peers as Hughes and Wright, Marquez and Mailer, Joyce and Weldon Johnson? As an aside, in the unlikely event that I ever achieve the status of an Adichie or a Gurner, I would personally want my archive to be housed at Nigeria's University of Ibadan, the alma mater of literary giants, including Achebe and Amadi, Okibo and Osindari, Soyinka and Ogundipe, and if not at Ibadan, then of course at the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, but then I'm biased. The desire to leave a legacy is fierce and understandable. Yet these institutions are to African literary archives what European museums are to African artifacts. Unlike the Benin bronzes, the archives are not the spoils of war. They are, however, the spoils of history, and it is the victors of this history who continue to reap the rewards of the past and benefit from their conquests. And this is one way in which they do so. Another reason we tend to see African literary archives as different from African artifacts when it comes to the matter of repatriation is that the looting of the artifacts happened at a particular point in time. In the case of the Benin bronzes, 1897. This fact of time is important because it distinguishes their looting as an historical event, meaning it has a start date and significantly an end date, which makes it possible to conceptualize and maybe even understand their provenance. Consequently, it becomes possible to both argue for and against their return. In the case of the former, it is easier to justify their current location as a fact of history that cannot and should not be changed, and to dismiss and distance ourselves from their looting as being nothing to do with us, since it happened long into the past and not in our time. By contrast, the continual loss of African literary archives is an ongoing process. It's happening right now. Moreover, because the loss of the archives isn't accompanied by the kind of barbaric violence that wrested the bronzes from Benin, and their export is voluntary, albeit enforced by the conditions elaborated on earlier, we perhaps don't feel their absence as much, the drip-drip effect, as opposed to the spectacle of a dramatic event. It has become the norm, and we rarely question the status quo. The exception, which would be newsworthy, is when the archives are retained by an African institution, like those of the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, whose papers, or part of whose papers, now reside at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in South Africa, after a last-minute reprieve that would have seen them go instead to the British Library. Why should it matter that the archives are not in Africa, especially if they are being given the type of care and use they may not receive if they were on the continent? Because in Western institutions, the archives of African writers are uprooted and displaced. They live in a kind of exile and are transformed. Out of their native context, they become a source of anthropological study as opposed to literary study, looked at as opposed to looked to. Let me give you an example. In April of this year, I visited Zurich's Rietberg Museum to view an exhibition called The Future is Blinking, which focused on the work of the earliest local photographers in West and Central Africa towards the end of the 19th century. As I was walking around the gallery, immersing myself in the capsules of time that contained within them fragments of my people's history, I noticed that I was the only person of African descent there on that particular afternoon. I became aware that as I was looking at the exhibits, I was also being looked at, studied even, by the dozen or so other visitors sharing the space with me at the time. I, after all, had literal skin in the game, not just in the exhibition, but in the exhibits themselves, the subjects of the images. With that, I, like the images, out of context in this museum space, became part of the exhibition, an object of observation. I was the viewer and the viewed. At the exhibition, I took an excessive amount of photos and videos, which I shared in real time with my colleague, Ernest, a documentary photographer in Ghana. I felt excited and guilty that I was there and he wasn't, and I wanted him to experience it as I was experiencing it. As a practicing photographer on the continent, and having been born and raised in Ghana, where many of the images were taken, he had even more of a vested interest in the exhibition than I did, yet he was far, far away from where they were being shown. This was his direct heritage, and he could learn a lot from his predecessors in the field. But as an African citizen, it was no simple task for him to jump on a plane to see an exhibition in a European museum. Why should African artists and writers have to travel to the West to learn about and from African artists and writers? Despite the obvious material impediments to international travel for the average African citizen, such as lack of financial resources, but more detrimentally, the high number of visa rejections issued by Western embassies to African applicants, there is also the moral argument about why Africans should have to journey abroad to benefit from their own cultural heritage. So what can we do to ensure that archives, literary or otherwise, stay on the continent and that archives are returned? I should say that I'm not so concerned with archives that are already outside of Africa, though having access to these would be a real boon for African writers on the continent, wanting to learn how their predecessors went about their work, oftentimes in difficult circumstances. What I am interested in is eradicating the conditions that effectively compel African writers to deposit their archives abroad, which means ensuring that future archives don't need to leave the continent for the reasons previously discussed in order to be respected, both by the institutions that house them and the literary world of which they are a part. Firstly, we need to create robust institutions that value literature as cultural and historical products worthy of preservation. These institutions must serve both students of literature and African writers themselves, so that the latter can make informed choices about where their archives should go, and the former won't need to leave the continent in order to learn their craft. As it goes, there are very few universities in Africa that offer creative writing degrees. If we agree that the purpose of an archive is to bear witness to the past and to the evolution of a writer's thought and their development as a writer, then the case for their repatriation becomes even more potent, particularly where it concerns the nurturing of young writers. Secondly, we need to collect the past. To quote the literary academic and scholar of African-American literature, Jean-Christophe Cloutier, given the lack of institutions dedicated to the Black experience, the novel became an alternative site of historical preservation, a means to ensure both individual legacy and group survival. Much of Africa's literary output from the 19th century to the mid-1900s and even later is out of print or difficult to get hold of. The hard work of rebuilding the African canon is like trying to put together a puzzle in which a sizable proportion of the pieces are missing. Sourcing these texts requires much digital detective work, as well as hours spent scouring through dusty bookshelves in secondhand and antiquarian bookstores in Europe and America in search of that magic find. As Cloutier notes, books, especially those from the early past, are sites of Black social, cultural, and historical preservation. Today, the creation, production, and consumption of African literature is heavily influenced and even determined by Western tastes, with writers often having to produce work with a view to the non-African reader. By collecting the past, we can help ensure continuity between what was and what is, fill gaps in knowledge, and track the evolution of contemporary African literature. Thirdly, we must document the present as individuals and institutions in real time and not just online. We need to own our own work. My friend, the Ghanaian photojournalist, Nipa Dennis, made this point at the LOATAD symposium earlier this year, that as a jobbing photojournalist, the majority of his clients are Western news organizations, meaning the work of African photographers like himself continues to be exported and owned by those outside the continent. The same is true of literature, and digital restitution isn't enough. Fourth, we must archive the future. That is to say, we must archive for the future. By reconstructing the past and documenting the present, we can consciously create counter-histories and alternative futures, or, to use a play on the words of the celebrated African-American speculative fiction writer, Octavia Butler, we can create a future history that is more beautiful and truthful than the past. Finally, we need to create transnational networks with like-minded individuals and organizations across the continent in the diaspora, and explore ways in which we can work together to maximize our impact and connect our communities to the resources we all hold. This could be in the form of loans of key items in our collections, joint programming, and exchanges. There are many renegade decolonized libraries and archives doing the work of bringing African literature to light and ensuring it gets into the hands of the people. And strength in numbers is always required. All this is what we have been trying to do as a decolonized institution at the Library of Africa and the African diaspora since our inception in 2017. The word decolonized has been thrown into question of late. A number of scholars, including most recently the Nigerian philosopher Olufemi Tayo, have sought to show how the term has become devoid of meaning and how it deprives Africans of agency. Whatever we call the process of centering African literature and scholarship, the archives play a crucial role in restoring Africa's cultural heritage and making it whole. Thank you.